All right, welcome to Researching Happy, episode 9. This is the show all about the stories behind the studies of the research world of happiness and well-being. And today we've got a great guest on, Dr. Eri Mountbatten-O'Malley. And Eri's focus is on a risk, I think, in the field, a mistake that we often make, including myself, which is, I think, our flippant use of language in this space when we're talking about key psychological terms. So obviously well-being is something that we've discussed a little bit, the issue around how we talk about well-being. We mean different things when we say the same word. But Eri's focus is on the concept of flourishing. And we you know, it's a buzzword. We hear it more and more, and really no one's actually done the work that Eri has done to really clarify what does it mean and what are the pitfalls of its use if we're using it incorrectly. So I think you're going to enjoy this episode. I think I'm really pleased that there are people like Eri in the world, basically. It hasn't always been a comfortable ride for him, but he's stuck with it, as you'll hear. And it's an exciting development, I think, because it's, this well-being and happiness research is probably, it's been around for a while, but it's been really revitalized with the positive psychology movement. And I think it's getting more and more exciting as people come from different disciplines and weigh in and improve the field. And I think this is a perfect example of that. So in terms of the show, this is episode 9. Really pleased with how it's going so far. Please continue to reach out and give feedback or thoughts or ideas. I'm really appreciating that. If you are enjoying the episode, please share it with one other person. Or subscribe on YouTube, Spotify. These are just little things that can make a big difference for the show. And if you're really interested in supporting, we've already had a couple of supporters and we really appreciate that, who have come on board and joined our locals account. And we're going to start doing monthly catch-ups through that. I think support starts from $5. I don't think, I know. It starts from $5 and it makes a big difference for us. So with that, thank you. Enjoy the show. And let me know what you think of Eri. Okay, so here we go. This is Researching Happy. We've got, I'm going to say someone from outside the box a little bit, because I think we've sort of been in the positive psychology world a little bit to date. And so this is a guest who I think can blow the roof off positive psychology a little bit. So I kind of feel like this guest is about to ruin my day, but in a good way. So we have with us Dr. Eri Mountbatten-O'Malley. So welcome, Eri.
Thank you, Matthew, for the invite.
No problems, and thanks for accepting the invite. I've got a little bio that I've kind of abridged from your website, Eri, so I'll just read it out and let me know if I've made any mistakes along the way. So Eri is a senior lecturer in education and policy at Bath Spa University. He has almost 10 years experience conducting social policy research in areas such as well-being, mental health, higher education, policy and practice, and social welfare. Eri is an elected national executive member of Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain, Greater Britain, I don't know where that is, and a contributing member to the leadership of Flourishing group supported by Harvard and Oxford universities. So Eri's recent PhD thesis is titled Human Flourishing, a Conceptual Analysis. And that's really what I'm referring to, and the idea that, you read it and you think we think we know what we're talking about, and then someone comes along and tells you, actually, we've got a long way to go. And that's part of the process too. So you're laughing. I don't know, it's because you agree or disagree, Eri, but...
Sorry, I've got a bit of a sinister giggle going on here. First point, I mean, I suppose I should just say that I'm not, I'm not interested in slating any field.
Yep.
There's loads of really good work going on in positive psychology, and it was positive psychology that inspired my work in Flourishing. I did a short course, and I just fell in love with the concepts and with the whole reflective processes on the virtues and all these and character traits and all of this sort of stuff. So there's loads of goodness in there. So just to sort of preempt anything that I have to say that's critical, there is also a lot of love for the field.
Yeah, no, look, I appreciate that, and I kind of do want to slight the foot a little bit, but that's okay. Maybe I'll make up for your peace treaty that you just laid down there. But
Okay.
well, let's start by hearing a little bit about yourself. So we've sort of just introduced ourselves. Basically, you're in Bath. You did study a little bit in Cardiff. You said
Aberystwyth.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And so I already got it wrong. So you said you sort of found out about post-psych. You did a short course. Tell us how you sort of found out about this sort of world.
Yeah, so I suppose it's worth flagging up front, partially with the intro that you gave in terms of my background, which was in social policy research, social welfare, well-being, mental health. So after graduating from Aberystwyth University in Mid Wales, it's the oldest department of international politics in the world. Wow. So it's quite prestigious, even though it's in this really small town in the middle of Wales on the coast. But it's a beautiful area, but a really good department of international politics. So I graduated, and I wasn't really sure what to do at that point. I kind of wanted to. Before graduating, I thought I was going to go and work at the Foreign Service. So that was where my aims were, to go and work in diplomacy, that type of thing. But I'd lost a lot of faith in the whole political system during the course of my studies. So I decided it wasn't for me. And I ended up training up for Citizens Advice Bureau. I don't know if you have anything similar there in Australia, but basically it's a free advice service for members of the public. So when they have issues over debt or housing or mental health or accessing services, health services, whatever it might be, they come in and they will be allocated a caseworker if it's a complex case. And I was one of those specialist caseworkers. So I was trained up within Citizens Advice Bureau and went through that quite rapidly, to be honest, after graduating. And I was just sort of biding my time whilst deciding what to do with my career and what to do with the future, really. And it was really interesting work. So there was a lot of legal casework and policy work, as well as, casework for vulnerable groups and those that suffer from mental health issues, substance misuse, vulnerable communities, really. So I was a specialist caseworker on a major big lottery funded project, working for Citizens Advice, and I developed quite a good technique of using cases of clients, obviously with their permission, but using cases to lobby for social change, whether that be at the local or national level. So I was involved in that sort of arena for some years. So that's both advice, advocacy, and campaigning, if you like, but use it through cases. And so I was interested in I became very interested in psychology, in mental health, and I did a number of different courses around supporting those with mental health issues, suicidal thoughts, all those sorts of things. So I got very interested in the whole sort of sphere of psychology, I suppose. And one of the perks of, so I moved then to the Students' Union, which was for the university in Aberystwyth. And I was then doing the same sort of thing, but working with students, higher education students. So casework, advice and I would support the elected sabbatical officers as well with campaigns and policy research, things like that. And as part of one of the perks of working at the university is you get all sorts of free courses, which the university run, but they give you, one of the perks of being an employee. And there was this one introduction to positive psychology. And so I just, it was a 3 or 4 month course, something like that. And so I thought, I'll do it over, summer, it looks really interesting. I'll just have a look at it, check it out. And I really just fell in love. So there's this really good little book. I don't know if I've got it here somewhere. I probably do. No, I'll have to find it. But anyway, it's, so here we are. No, it's not that That's all right. I'll find it. So there's Positive Psychology in a Nutshell by Ilona. Is it Bakewell? I think it is. Anyway, so
Bonnewell,
Bonnewell, Ilona Bonnewell. Sorry, Ilona. The course was really structured around her book, and so it was a lot of reflective practice and thinking about the virtues, timeline, lifespan, considerations, personal development, personal growth, all that sort of stuff. I just absolutely loved it. Totally fell in love with it.
What year was this roughly, Eri?
Sorry, say again?
What year was this roughly?
Oh gosh, this must have been, I don't know, 2010, something like that. Yeah, something roughly.
So pretty early in the story of positive psychology.
I suppose it was. I mean, well, it's been around since 2000s odd, hasn't it? Really, sort of been exploding since then. But yeah, I suppose it was reasonably early. And so so I got really interested in the field, and essentially what happened is I felt that a lot of the campaigning and the policy work that I'm doing in mental health was successful. There were some really big wins, especially locally for mental health, accessing services and things. But I felt like there's something else missing, that it's almost like there's a never-ending treadmill of social justice issues and problems, and that if you spend all your time fighting injustice, then it's kind of draining and exhausting, and it needs to be done. But I was interested in actually more forward-looking approaches, which obviously positive psychology is all strengths-based approaches, isn't it? So I was interested in actually, maybe there needs to be a shift in focus towards actually what we need to do positively rather than fighting all the injustice and the problems. So that was a segue, if you like, from the policy campaigning work towards the sort of strengths-based future, orientation in terms of my academic interests, and an opportunity came up for a funded PhD program at Edgehill University, which is outside Liverpool, and so I put a proposal in because I had been wanting. This was my dream, was to do a PhD for some years, but I just couldn't figure out how to do it, how to afford it, because they're expensive, and there wasn't the loan system. At the moment, we've got a loan system for postgraduate work. They didn't have that in place at the time, so you have to purely rely on either funded PhDs or self-funded. So that got me interested, and then I applied for the GTA program, which is a graduate teacher assistant program, which is a PhD alongside teaching experience and a teaching qualification for higher education, and then and it was accepted effectively. So that really got me. That's the sort of build up to my PhD, really.
Yeah, great. Okay, and so where did the philosophy, like your book is, or your forthcoming book, I guess, but your thesis to as it exists so far is so heavily philosophical. I mean, that's how it reads to me. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, it's
Okay,
philosophy par excellence. I'm not self-praising there. I just mean that it's exactly what the core of philosophy is, which is conceptual analysis. Really, that's yeah.
And so, where did that come into the story? The sort of the background of the need or the idea, I guess, is pretty unique.
Yes, well, I mean, so it's a good question, because initially, my work was empirical up to that point. Yeah, so my work was essentially policy related and using quantitative or mixed methods to gather issues in communities or amongst services and things like that. So it was empirical social science paradigm, if you like. And so my application for the PhD was actually an empirical piece of work. So it was what I was interested in doing was researching human flourishing amongst higher education students. And so that's the proposal. That's kind of how I was accepted on. But very soon, I mean, it was a huge learning curve, but very soon, having the time to, explore the literature, in depth, as you do as a PhD student. You get a lot of time to obviously dig into the literature and everything else. Very quickly, it became apparent that the field was a bit of a mess. That it seemed rather arbitrary. So it seemed like you just come up with a conception of human flourishing, you come up with a grid of different measures, and then you measure populations or people against that measure, and then you make claims about what flourishing is in that community based on that rather arbitrary model that you've just created. So there wasn't, if you like, what I could see was missing was there wasn't any fundamental piece of work that was addressing what flourishing is, other than through kind of like theorizing, which effectively comes down to opining. That's the way I looked at it, at least, as well. I just thought, well, actually, these are, these theories that you see in human flourishing, like Frederickson and Lusada and Seligman and others, the theories that they put forward, they don't really seem to have any ground. There's not really any foundation to the claims that they're making, other than they're just putting it forward like, this is what my theory of and often they're conflated. Often they would conflate flourishing with well-being or happiness or life satisfaction, and all these different interchangeable terms that you often be used interchangeably, and often the biggest conflation would be with well-being. It would be reduced to well-being of some sort. So I found that conceptually problematic, and I thought, well, why should I contribute to the mess in the literature? I didn't want to contribute to that and just have another, because my supervisors wanted me to do that. My research team, they wanted me to devise my own model of flourishing. And actually they were advising me that this is a great opportunity. You can really make a name for yourself. You could have your Mountbatten, model of human flourishing, and whatever. So there was lots of excitement around the prospect of developing a new model of flourishing.
Sure.
But I wasn't at all interested in that.
They didn't realize who I was speaking to, did they? Yeah.
it would just, for me, it would just contribute to the problem that I'm identifying. It's like, well, why would I want to contribute to that problem by just adding another model in the market of ideas? So I thought, well, far better to evaluate what's going on with flourishing, what we mean by flourishing, and how to really develop a way to evaluate all of these different models. That's really, I suppose, what's underlying my interest is, well, how can we make sense of the chaos and the mess in the literature?
So firstly, I love where this is about to go, I think, because I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think in our work that we've done, we do a lot of empirical work. I think that's what drew us to Corey Keyes' model, of the models, because it did seem the least arbitrary, that's for sure. And Corey has been a guest on the show so far, so people can look back to that. But at least, right. It did feel like it had more of a grounding than just like, here's 10 things I came up with at the pub, which I have kind of actually heard that is sometimes how some of these models, are made up. I don't know if people tell me that as a joke, but it actually sounded pretty serious. Because it does come from that place of just like, what makes sense to me. That does seem to be it's
kind of subjective, yeah.
So we just did this review of measures of mental health. So we've been thinking a little bit about this for some time, and we've got a preprint up. Won't go into the detail too much, but basically just to sort of endorse your position, what we thought we would do is we would find measures of well-being or of positive mental health. Everyone's using these terms interchangeably, like you said. And we sort of said, let's just start with the WHO definition, just because that's kind of an accepted thing, even though lots of people have lots of problems with it. We'll start there. But even in that definition, you see aspects of well-being, you see aspects of quality of life, you see resilience and coping as well. So we kind of thought, each of these are themselves umbrella terms, meaning that they then point to lots of other different things. So we thought if we do that's how we constructed our search, basically, of what are the measures that are out there of well-being, of resilience, and of quality of life. And basically, to endorse your point, the reason why we went with measures as well was because we thought that's where people have, the rubber's hit the ground. So this theorizing has at least had some
feels
amount
more
of work
solid.
put into it. Yeah, they've done at least some bit of work to have actually developed this thing and then to have tested empirically. We found 155 different measures of well-being, or of positive mental health, which claim to be measuring 400 different things. But then you go through that list of 400. It's like, obviously this is untenable, right? So just completely supporting what you're talking about.
I could have used your study at the beginning of my PhD. That would have helped.
Yeah, well, there you go. There you go. If only the journals had accepted it 2 years ago, which they could have, but they chose not to. So then what we've done is we've said, this list of 400 is obviously untenable and probably not even true. You go through the list and you see, well, someone's measured happiness, someone else has measured positive emotion, someone else has measured vitality, and then there's energy levels. So when we've synthesized that down, there's about 21 different aspects that we've kind of found that look unique and consistent across the literature. But anyway, we can... That was just an endorsement of this issue that's out there, which is that every person has just come up with their own thing, and there's really no way to determine which measure should we be using or which model is the right one.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the issue, I mean, the foundation that I think a lot of the social science and positive psychology researchers, they rest on, a lot of it is they will come up with some intuitions, which is basically just opinions. So they will come up with some intuitions about the meaning of the terms that they are interested in, and then they might go out and research what does it mean to you, sort of thing, and then they'll get a load of data from participants, what it means for them, and then that's the sort of basis of their model. It's kind of informed qualitatively in a way. They try to get the sort of opinions from people, I guess, from the public. And there's an element of that which is unproblematic. I think, to be honest, the general population don't actually generally have problems with understanding what flourishing means. I don't think it's a problem with us understanding it in everyday terms. The problem is in the academic literature when they try to carve it up, measure it, theorize. That's where the problems are. It's not it's not that much of a problematic term in ordinary language. It's really, the problem is really in the methodological approaches to understanding the concept. So in some regards, just it's not such a bad thing just going out and asking people what flourishing is for them. It's part of what I'm doing with Flourish Cafe. I'll talk about later. But I mean, there's an unproblematic aspect to that. But then the problematic aspect is when you're making general claims.
Yes.
It's so that you're not making a distinction then between opinions and qualitative approaches, between that. Because, of course, positive psychology, and Seligman has said it and others, haven't they? Csikszentmihalyi as well. It's supposed to be the science, the social science of the virtues or whatever. Yeah. So they're looking for a scientific generalization. That's what they're looking for. And that's where the problem lies, is in those so-called scientific generalizations. It's not so much in the ordinary data that you get from people asking them what it means to them. That's really useful, probably. But if you try to make general claims, that's when you hit problems. Yeah.
And, this is a new podcast. I'm not exactly sure who my audience is or how familiar they are with some of this stuff. So I'll just try and slow it down a little bit. But what I'm...
Sorry if I'm going a bit technical.
No. And look, I respect the capacity of the audience that they can learn any of this stuff for sure. But what was I going to say now? It's escaped me. You were just saying. So we had last week or a couple of weeks ago we had Dr. Mark Fabian from Warwick. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. No, so he's sort of in this sort of more from a public policy, economic background, but he's merging like a lot of well-being and philosophical conceptualizations of well-being together. And you ask him what's the definition of well-being, he starts with that very philosophical answer, which is the prudential good. And I guess is that what I'm hearing from you? Is you're saying that if that's how you're going to start with your definition of flourishing, you can't you can't put a narrow definition of what flourishing is because the prudential good is different for everybody. Is that the issue that you're raising when you're talking about generalization?
Yeah. So it's worth just mentioning that the devil is in the detail, and
Yep.
and context is king, and so that's the trouble with these generalizations, is that they iron out all of the really interesting human context. They also ignore the contextual nuance of our uses of our terms like flourishing, which, as I explore in the thesis, there are a number of different meanings. So they're kind of distinct concepts completely, depending on how what your context is. There are distinctions between flourishing. For example, in the chapter A Sketch of Flourishing, I talk about the distinctions between flourishing nations, flourishing civilizations, flourishing persons. So flourishing in your role. So there are a number of different distinctions so we mustn't be blinded by the word flourishing.
Yeah.
We've got to really look at what's the meaning, what's the intention, what's going on behind the use in a context, and then we can figure out whether it's flourishing or whether it's well-being we mean, or whether it's happiness or whatever else it is. And so the problem that I'm raising really is with a certain blindness there is in the social sciences and positive psychology. There's a certain blindness to that nuance. There's a blindness to seeing that actually using a word just because you're using a word doesn't make that the same thing in one context as another context. There can be completely different concepts, but there's all that blurring going on in the literature where you use the word and you mean something else, but they think it's the same thing because the word is the same. So it's a really basic point. It's not anything particularly profound and insightful, but if you don't have philosophical training or philosophical experience, then I can see how, it would be difficult to kind of grapple with some of those issues. So it's the philosophy that really helps to understand how concepts work, what concepts are, the distinction between words and concepts, and the importance of context and situation and particularity. These are philosophical issues that emerge through experience and training in philosophical approaches, particularly certain forms of analytic philosophy, which is the approach that I take. It's Wittgensteinian approaches, and he was very much a philosopher of language, and so that really underpins the understanding of my thesis. And I think that's what's missing in the literature, is that sensitivity to the complexity of language in terms of how it's really pinned down to the context of use. And that is all important. That is, you could have two researchers using the same words and talking about completely different things.
Yeah,
yet they think they're talking about the same thing.
Yeah. Could you?
So there are profound implications then for measurement and generalization, the claims you can make generally and things like that. They're really profound. Yeah.
And
does that make sense?
It does. I reckon it would help with a bit of a concrete example if there's something you could sort of illustrate that issue with.
Well, I mean, other than the examples I've given, I mean, one example is, I suppose, in Christiansen's recent work on flourishing as the aim of education. So he, for example, defines flourishing for students as student objective well-being. But then why call it flourishing?
Yeah.
It's objective well-being. It's not the same thing. So, but it's packaged as flourishing, but actually what's going on is student objective well-being. Well, that's not the same thing as flourishing. Obviously he goes to lengths to try to argue it is the same thing, but it just isn't, for a number of different reasons. Which I talk about in the thesis. Which is that well-being is fleeting. For example, it's, well-being is something that is more related to moods and things like that. Certainly subjective well-being, which is the most common form of well-being that they talk about in the literature. This idea of objective well-being is, I problematize that as well, because the what do we mean by objective well-being? There's so much in the detail that just needs thought. And I think that the trouble is, it's a little bit like the tail is wagging the dog in the literature. Yeah. It shouldn't be that way round, so they have a paradigm that they need to fit it into, and that, you know what I mean, rather than actually looking at the problem and letting the problem drive the approach and the understanding. Instead of that, they're doing it the other way around. They're thinking, right, I've got this paradigm, it's social science paradigm, I'm going to apply it to this. But then in order to do that, they have to cut a lot of corners, do a lot of strained justifications, and theorizing in order to try to make it fit. And then you just end up with something completely different. And so it's a methodological problem, really, that's at the core of it.
Yeah, and just as you were speaking, I was wondering where does this come from? And I wonder, I bet you I would imagine, I guess I'm keen to hear your thoughts, but in terms of, people have heard about this positive psychology thing from one way or another, mostly say it's been in the social sciences or in psychology to begin with, like the first 10, 15, 20 years. It's obviously now branching out, and other people are sort of being exposed to these ideas in to characterize it sort of simply. So there is an evolution, I would imagine, as these ideas get out and they're tested now, and like very similar to the way that you've gone about it, that you've come from a particular perspective, or maybe from a particular methodology. You've heard these ideas, they don't resonate, it's not working for you. And ultimately that contest of ideas will produce something that's even stronger in the long run. And I wonder how much of that's just a natural progression of research.
Yeah, I agree. And just because I identify flaws in the field doesn't mean that it's a suggestion that it should never have happened, for example.
Exactly.
We all come from our own positionality and our experience, and we use our gifts. And obviously, the social science researchers and positive psychologists are going to make the most of their existing set of skills and gifts in order to apply, to the concept. And obviously, there was a period when, positive psychology was booming, and it was, and flourishing is seen as a bit of a sexy concept, if you like. That's it. There is this evolution, and Paul Wong's work. Obviously, I don't know if you've had him on your show, but he's probably someone important to try to get hold of.
Yeah, I've definitely reached out. He's sort of trying to work out a date.
Brilliant, yeah. So I mean, so I have spoke to Paul, and he's brilliant. Quite eccentric, but absolutely brilliant. His obviously adaptation to the field is to highlight the importance of suffering and character development, because that was somewhat of a neglected area in the earlier versions of positive psychology. So that's an example of developments in the field which are important, and that's all good. So yes, I mean, in a way, I hope that positive psychologists will grapple with my research and realize the importance of nuance and contextual uses, etc. But the problem is that it fundamentally undermines the whole paradigm of their approach. So they may adapt, and you can still retain the paradigm and try to just put in some words and sentences about, it's important to think about context. But you still haven't actually got rid of the baggage, which is the core problem, which is the whole idea of measurement and the whole idea of technicalizing concepts and making generalizations. That's the fundamental problem. And so, in a way, what I'm doing is advancing a philosophy of human flourishing, which is it's its own paradigm, if you like. It's difficult to try to merge and adapt in an evolutionary way, in a minor steps way, when there's such fundamental problems. So it kind of needs a bit of a shift. But I'm not expecting many to grab hold of it like that and to do that, because I think it's, people have built careers on the back of it, and this is what they've been doing their entire lives. So, but I'm hoping that it may be mostly of interest to early career researchers, and those interested in that are looking at developing their approaches to these sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a bit where I was going with the logistics. Is exactly like you say. People have, off the back of their expertise in this world, it's hard for someone who I'm sure personally would find it easier to navigate this change, would find it very difficult to professionally navigate this change and say, actually, to my funders and everyone else, like,
and that's just how academia works. And it's understandable. It takes a long time to build up, a career and reputation. So they're not going to just suddenly turn corners. I mean, most are not. Some might.
In terms of those fundamental sort of frictions that you're sort of talking about, have we sort of described those? I just want to make sure that we've covered that off very clearly. What are the fundamental frictions? So you've obviously spoken a lot about the generalizability of these concepts. You've spoken about the sort of the arbitrariness of the combinations of features of well-being or of flourishing. Is there anything else? Because I know you've got sort of normativity and context. I wonder whether we could go a little bit into those two, and if there's anything else.
It just depends on. So sitting behind all of this exploration is an understanding of how language works and what language is, and that's an important thing. That is another area that's just ignored and obscured by the research that is out there. So it kind of builds on what we've been talking about already, which is the normativity of concepts. So normativity is an interesting term. So in the thesis, I carve out two ways of looking at normativity. So normativity fundamentally means something that is rule bound. Yeah, so it's rule oriented. So the general way that we use normativity, even in philosophy, but across the board, normativity is generally seen as helping to describe norms. So social norms, public norms. There are norms that. So for example, normative philosophy or that sort of area would be interested in morals and ethics and those sorts of things. So that's generally how we understand the term normativity in the research. But there's another way to see normativity, which is important in the context of philosophy of language, which is something that I've relied heavily on Peter Hacker's work, from a retired Oxford professor. And he talks about normativity in terms of language, so the grammatical rules of our terms. So there are two ways to see normativity. It's like a sort of Janus face thing. One is norms, social norms, things like that, and the other is norms in language use. So norms in terms of language use is the area that I'm really fundamentally interested in my PhD and forthcoming book. And it really amounts to the fact, for example, just to give you one example, there are limitations on what can be said meaningfully. So if we want to say something like, I flourish by cutting my arms. Yeah. There are ethical, obviously, reasons why that might be wrong, or normative in the conventional sense. But there are also, normative, like as in grammatical rules. That I'm talking about conceptual grammar, not normal English syntax grammar, etc. So in terms of the conceptual grammar that sits behind flourishing, because of the limitations of what flourishing means, you can't use it in that sort of context. So you can't say, for example, I'm hurting myself in order to flourish. There's a logical reason why that is senseless. It doesn't make any sense. So that's one example of why normativity matters in the context of philosophy of language. Another example might be where there's no sense at all, even in the string of words. I'm just trying to think of an example. Chomsky's, it's an example that I use in the thesis, but Chomsky's famous example that colorless green chairs sleep furiously, for example, is an example of a sentence where in English grammar, there's nothing wrong with that in terms of the order of words.
Yeah.
Colorless green chairs sleep furiously. It makes sense in terms of conventional grammar, but the conceptual grammar behind it is senseless. There's no sense in the conceptual grammar. So, for example, you can't have something that's colorless and green. Chairs aren't the sort of thing that sleep, and you can't sleep furiously. That's so okay. So it's a kind of extreme example just to highlight that the importance of conceptual sense. So there is conceptual sense that sits behind our ordinary use of language. Otherwise, it would be kind of like a bit of a comedy. We'd just be talking nonsense to each other all the time. Actually, that does happen as well. But you just be talking nonsense to each other, and it's kind of like a comedy sketch. There's absolute. There's the people who don't understand each other. They're talking cross purposes. And it's kind of absurd and ridiculous. So when we're talking about research, obviously there's an ethical and a professional imperative to be clear about what we mean before we go out and research and do stuff, because it impacts the world. It's not just us sitting in a room theorizing and writing stuff in a diary, in a reflective journal or something. When we're doing research, we're doing stuff that's going to impact the world negatively or positively. So there's that ethical. So there's a duty to talk sense in what we're saying, to make sense in what we're saying. Ill-conceived policies lead to harms. That was a big issue that I'd been dealing with in my earlier social science stuff. But also in the thesis as well. So ill-conceived policies are just they cause tremendous harm, and ill-conceived research equally causes a lot of harm. I think, for example, measuring children against character traits, and things like that, so that there is an ethical problem there with labeling and limiting, the prospects for children in terms of their characterological development. So there are real world impacts. So that's why these things really matter. That's why it matters. Ethically speaking, there's a duty on researchers. That's why I suggest researchers, writers, academics need to spend time on these sorts of issues. Does that help at all?
No, it absolutely does. There's a few directions I'd like to go. I'm just trying to prioritize them in my mind as I'm thinking. But just as a side note, it's been popping up in my head, so I just got to say it out there. But I don't know if you've read Professor Lindsay Odes' stuff on wellbeing literacy. So he's, I don't know if you know Lindsay, he's in Melbourne, and he's going deep down that path of language and I think Wittgenstein's sort of philosophy into the conceptualization of how should we encourage and eventually assess literacy or wellbeing literacy in individuals. But I have had this reaction, and I've definitely heard others have this reaction. I mean, I've tried to wrangle with it a little bit, but it's like, it's too complicated. Like, as they get into language and starting to move into this philosophy of language, like, it's just out of the box for people that are more into that psychological literacy. Psychological literature. You just have this. It's just complicated, and your researchers are super busy people, I think, these days. So there are these logistical issues that come up of like, it's going to take me a long time to get my head around this stuff. Yeah. So I can, I just wanted to put that as a side note. So that's someone I think who's moving definitely in a very parallel direction to you.
Great.
But I've heard firsthand people say like, too complicated.
Yeah, and it's actually not that complicated, but I think that there is a learning curve. There is, because it is another way of thinking. It's a different style of thinking. Yeah, and that so that is what's the biggest challenge is kind of disinvesting yourself of kind of pathological ways of thinking. Because of course you've become habituated into a certain style of thought, and that's natural with especially those educators, who spent a whole career nurturing their expertise in these sorts of areas, it's very difficult to disinvest yourself of that kind of way of thinking, and to be really open-minded. So it's about nurturing the virtues, I suppose. It's a really beautiful thing, and this is something that I experienced during the course of the PhD. It's a really beautiful thing to. It's kind of like riding the surf, or doing some sort of adrenaline sport or something, but of the mind.
Okay. Cool.
You're riding the edge of your capacity, and it's really exciting and terrifying.
All from the comfort of your office chair, right?
Yeah. Office chair surfing. I don't know, but yeah, it's a very exciting thing, and Aristotle and others have spoken about the concept of wonder, and I spoke at a conference in 2019 in Amsterdam on the concept of wonder called Lost in Wonder. I read a paper then. And wonder, Aristotle talks about wonder being the beginning of philosophy. And I think it is. So fundamentally, we need to nurture that attitude of wonder. That nurtures the other, virtues in us, like humility, open-mindedness. I'm also nurturing these in myself, that I have to constantly check myself, that I'm not walking into preconceived, sort of almost like default ways of thinking. So it's kind of it's a challenge, and it's a challenge, especially in an environment where you have to churn out research papers, as part of your role and your job, where you just have to keep doing. Actually, what we need is a bit more time to reflect, and think, and we need to have that space to do it. And so I think, it is a bit of a learning curve, I suppose.
Absolutely, and I guess, I think we probably mentioned it in previous episodes, but for those who haven't heard those, that most researchers, their CV and their job prospects are tied to the volume of papers that they write and have accepted and published. So, taking 6 months off to say, actually, I need to think deeply about this issue. You either have to be like a master at juggling, to basically keep doing what you're working on anyway and somehow carve out this extra time. And I'm not sure how anyone does that. Or you basically, or you're probably your career would suffer, I guess. I mean, you could argue that, playing the long game, you might have more success. But I wonder, I want to go into context in a second. So we've covered normativity, but I just wonder, you've been thinking, when did you start your PhD? It must have been like 2019 or 2020, something like that.
17.
Or maybe earlier. 17.
Yeah,
Okay,
2017.
cool,
Although it's worth saying that I remember it was supposed to be an empirical piece. So for the first year,
gotcha.
that was the plan. So then it got then I had to go through a whole process of changing the methodology, which was a real struggle within the institution because they had interests in pursuing it as an empirical piece. So there was a big challenge in overcoming that hurdle and getting a new research team, becoming based in education instead of within health, which is where I was originally based. So they were very much in the science paradigm in health, which is why they couldn't help me with these philosophical issues as much, even though I did have someone that was working in sort of on the borderline between health and philosophy as well, but not in this area, so I really needed so I had to move faculties, in order to get access.
Wow. No, I didn't realize. And so then did that come with a different supervisory panel as well? Because it's now requiring a totally
new team.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Oh, so that's courageous for a number of reasons. But I guess
I nearly lost the PhD as a result.
Oh, really? And I guess the funding that comes with it.
It was hanging in the balance. Yeah, it was hanging in the balance. Yeah. Because I mean, I mean, I probably shouldn't say too much, but what I will say is just that there were financial implications, of course, because it had been. So that was what I needed to do was to start the PhD all over again after the first year.
Yeah.
So there had been a year where there was this negotiation between myself and my team, trying to figure out how to carve away that satisfies me in terms of my research focus where I think it needs to go, alongside the capacity of the team and alongside the willingness of the team to nurture that direction. But that was kind of a negotiation that went on really, for 6 months, and it just didn't work out. So we needed to find a completely new team, but before that being accepted by the institution, it was very much in the balance whether or not, there is a PhD happening here at all, because of course it was different from the proposal. It was a total shift. So but I have to give all the credit to the Edgehill leadership, because they did support it, and to their credit, and I was very fortunate to have had access to. I couldn't have really asked for a better director of studies, Dr. Leon Culbertson, who is just expert in these sorts of areas. So I managed to have him as my research mentor, director of studies, and we just spent loads of time together, talking about everything. We'll go to the pub, we'd meet in a bar, we'd have coffee, or we'd have a drink, or we'd go find an office, we'd get a load of magic whiteboard stuff on the walls, so I do mind maps, and it was a bit of it felt like a movie, to be honest. It was and he was so generous with his time, so we spent a lot of time together talking, because of course it was your question earlier was on how did I get into philosophy. Well, I was mentored into philosophy by Leon. So I was able to pick up those skills only because I had that strong support.
Cool. No, amazing. Thank you, Leon. No, I think that's such a
credit to Leon.
It's a credit, but it's a privilege as well. I think. Like, I'm sure back in the day when universities had like 15 PhD candidates, that was the norm, but I don't think getting that amount of time is really the norm anymore.
No, not at all.
It reminds me of I had a similarly close relationship with one of my supervisors, Dan Fastnack, and we have kids of a similar age, and we're at there's a farmers market here that we would go to on the weekends, and generally would meet up. And I remember that there was this sort of statistical error that we just kept running into. And basically, just one day we're at this farmer's market, and just, you swing in and out of talking about your normal life. Then for some reason, your research comes back up again, because I guess sometimes in life there's just blended. There is no difference between your sort of your work life and your real life.
That's it.
Because it's a passion. And anyway, it's the realization came maybe it's whatever it was, this statistical error, but that came to us in a random conversation between talking about what are we doing on the weekends at a farmer's market. No, that's definitely a privilege. That's cool. So I guess what I wanted to ask you was you're new to philosophy. You're having these really cool, deep conversations by the sounds of it. But there must have been this nagging feeling of, I'm about to tell an entire discipline that I think, I don't know what you're thinking, but, you could just to summarize it that they're wrong. I'm about to tell a whole discipline that they're wrong. Not to say that it's bad or what, all those other caveats, but were you feeling that, and how did you manage it?
Yeah. So, self-doubt is a part of the process. And obviously it being a new field for me, embarking on in terms of philosophy, there were many points of self-doubt, whether or not I would be able to actually achieve what's going on in my mind. So, to articulate it in a way that makes sense to others, and to do so in a way that is helpful, and to strike a right balance in terms of the tone and the language, because of course, who am I? I'm just a PhD student, up against these big giants, scrapping away, so there were all sorts of issues, but I suppose what pulled me through, and this is something that Leon said to me recently, because I was asking him, I was like, gosh, was incredible, really, that experience, you know. And I thanked him again because I saw him. I was doing a Flourish Cafe in the north, which he came to, and so we were talking about some of the experiences over dinner one evening, and I said to him, look, what did you see in me? Like, what was going on, you know, with that, you know, because you couldn't do that for everyone, you know, you gave me a lot of time. And he was like, well, Eri goes, look, you know, you were firstly curious, which is sometimes a rare quality. So you were curious, you were determined, you know, because I had to fight against the system itself in order to get this shape PhD that I wanted. And you were able, you know, which is a nice thing, again, for someone like him to say, because he's sort of Oxford level sophistication in his philosophy. I mean, he loves it where he is at Edge Hill, but in terms of prestige, you know, he probably deserves to be somewhere like Oxford. But anyway, yeah. So for me, I suppose I had a determination that this was an important area. You know, I suppose having experienced supporting others who have been subject to policy harms, it helped to motivate me through the self-doubt and the difficulty, because I thought that there's something really important here in terms of the potential impact on those who are being researched or having policies imposed on them. So in the background, there was that kind of sensitivity to, and that was driving me, you know, so there was a sense, I suppose, of moral courage that was driving me through. And that was what I was most interested in. I didn't want to, you know, piss off a load of experts in the field. And I wasn't going for that. But I wanted, at the same time, to be able to be truthful and to produce something that was helpful. So it was a difficult balance. I don't like putting myself out there the way I have with this. But at the same time, I think it's an important work that needs to be done. And I was amazed that nobody had done a philosophical analysis of human flourishing in all these like millennia. I was just like, what's going on? When I was looking around, I was like, I must have missed something. There must be one out there. And I just kept looking, couldn't find anything. I was like, gosh, nobody has done this yet. This is just amazing. So I suppose intellectual curiosity and determination, you know, and courage, they're the things that sort of pulled me through. Yeah, that's it really. But I didn't mean to scrap at the Giants. It was just that it was the sort of moral imperative that was driving me, I suppose.
Yeah. And look, I would imagine that those giants that you're talking about, I think if you are raising fair points, I think they would be receptive to these issues in general, I think would be my sense. I want to ask about the reception to this so far, because I guess it's pretty early. Like, you know, the thesis has just, I think, relatively recently been sort of published out there. But if I could just take one backward step. So I just wanted to just make sure we covered on context. So I know that's kind of now casting our mind back, but is context as simple as saying, like, you know, that my sense of flourishing of who I am at work compared with the context of home, compared with the context of, you know, my life in general? Is that kind of where we're going with context?
Yeah, that's all it is. It's not overly complicated. It's just the context of use, you know, you know, so for example, in the Sketch of Flourishing chapter, I talk about, you know, when we're talking about flourishing diseases or flourishing civilizations, there isn't a moral dimension. But when we're talking about human beings, like flourishing persons, there is a moral dimension. And that is why this context, it matters. You know, generally when we talk about flourishing, we're meaning something like good growth or something like that. But, you know, you could have, you know, a disease that is growing well and spreading well, and you know, so you know, there's no moral sort of dimension to it. Whereas when we're talking about human beings, you know, and this is something that really comes through, I think, in the thesis, is the moral dimension for human beings. It's really important, and I think that is, you know, the researchers in positive psychology try to cover that, I think, through character traits and that kind of approach. But I think that's wrong. I think that's the wrong sort of approach. So it's the moral dimension versus just the growth dimension.
Yeah.
So that's just one example of where context matters. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
and obviously building as well on the fact that sometimes you use a word and you mean something else. So context has implications on the concept that is being applied in a context.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Okay, God, this gets complicated pretty quickly. All right, so very cool. So I want to hear about Flourish Cafe. I'm conscious of the time. Just if we have early career researchers, we sort of said they're the more probably flexible, logistically flexible in the scope of the direction of their careers.
Yeah.
They're out there, let's say they're thinking that well-being and flourishing is synonymous, or they probably think that flourishing is like a state of optimal well-being. What would the advice be that you're giving to them in terms of what should they avoid, should they be doing?
I mean...
Or have I asked the impossible question?
Yes, it's a tricky one because, again, context matters. It depends what the problem is they're identifying.
Okay.
So I would just say just be driven by the problem that they have identified and not the other way around. Don't try to make a square peg fit into a round hole, so to speak. So be driven by the problem and really just spend time thinking about the problem. Is that problem articulated well? Because if the problem is articulated in a confused way, then it has a knock-on effect on everything else. So, I think probably that they should talk to a philosopher, but again, not all philosophers are, philosophy is a wide field. So, you have, like I said before, normative philosophy, moral philosophy, you've got, it's a bit of a contentious term, but, continental style philosophy versus analytic philosophy. So you have different forms of philosophy. So it's not just like go and talk to a philosopher and you'll get it sorted. I suppose you need someone who is sensitive to philosophy of language. That could be like an advisor and a help with articulating the fundamental research problem that's identified. And then I think if that is sorted at the early stage, then everything else should follow reasonably well from that. I think that's where the problems occur in the research is there's not enough time spent at that early stage on articulating the problem clearly.
Yeah, okay. And
then that has a knock-on effect on research methods, on interpretation of research, and applications. So it's really, it's just spending that time early on. I mean, you can read, they can read the thesis and they'll get a good idea of the sorts of problems, and that will help them to reflect on their own problematizing, process. But that's probably the best tip I can give.
Yeah, great. Okay. So then putting this into practice, I assume that Flourish Cafe is a practical application of the direction you'd like the field to go. You mentioned as well some sort of some policy initiatives that you've been working on as well, but maybe you can give us a bit of an idea of Flourish Cafe and maybe how that sort of exemplifies some of your thoughts and ideas.
So Flourish Cafe is a social enterprise that I started up last summer. It actually grew out of a couple of different strands that I've been interested in. So I've been interested in public philosophy, in thinking about practical applications for the public in terms of philosophical issues. That's been for some time. I did a talk up at Edge Hill as part of their Good Society series on what makes a flourishing society. That also got me thinking about... So that was a public talk bringing academics and members of the public together. So I was interested in that bridge between academia and civic society. So that was going on in the background, and then as part, so I was invited to an event in Oxford last spring by the global social leaders, and so there are a couple of researchers there. There's Katie and Emmy, and they are just they've published on leadership for flourishing. So Katie Granville Chapman and Emmy Bidson, and so they got they invited a load of thinkers and people that within their networks, but then they also reached out to me through LinkedIn actually, and invited me to speak on a panel. And so I got to meet people like Professor Matt Lee, who was the the head of empirical research at Harvard for many years, who founded the Community of Practice, the Harvard Human Flourishing Community of Practice meetings, and has been really active in all these. I mean, he's just a lovely, lovely, lovely guy. So he's someone who's actually worth again, someone else worth you interviewing. He's a good example of someone who is within the social science paradigm, but is open to new understanding, and is really curious, Yeah. So he's such a wonderful, humble, just gifted individual, and a really empathetic human being. So a real exemplar, I think. But anyway, so I'm a big fan of Matt's, in case you didn't spot that. But anyway, so I got to meet a load of people in the flourishing field. So that was the first time that I'd really reached out with these sorts of people. And it was a great event. It was really, really interesting. And there was a splinter group that developed from some of the attendees of the event, because one of the guys there works at the UN as a policy advisor, and Raja, and he basically thought about this idea of global flourishing goals, and he wanted to set up a little group to explore potential. So this was bridging flourishing and leadership, so this is the context. And so we met a lot. We met multiple times, and we talked about, whether it be a value, a human right, or a norm, and different things like that. And we did end up writing a paper that's up on the Harvard website, as a provocation. It's not a peer-reviewed paper, but it's a jointly authored paper that is intended as a provocation. But as part of those discussions, I got to meet Ramu Damodaran, who was a high official at the UN. So I had a really long conversation with him last summer whilst I was on holiday in Poland, actually. And he inspired me with this discussion, because I was just talking about everything, all the issues with society, polarization between different political factions, people losing their way. There's a lack of cohesion in society, all these sorts of issues, and how to really help policymakers to take flourishing seriously. And he was thinking so he gave some examples, because he's Indian, so he gave some examples from Gandhi and others, because there are lots of grassroots movements in India that are obviously inspirational. And he, I suppose, in a way, after talking with him for 2+ hours, I came away really encouraged personally to take responsibility myself. Up until that point, this sort of thing was not, I wasn't envisaging doing community stuff per se, but after talking with him, it just helped to crystallize in my mind that actually I shouldn't wait for others to do it, but I just need to get on with it myself. So I came up with basically I just came up with this idea of civic engagement. How am I going to do this? Right, well, I've been doing World Cafe as a method for some years. I knew about the World Cafe method. Is really powerful, transformative. It works for groups, for bringing different groups together. And I thought, well, look, why not marry these two ideas together with Flourishing and World Cafe? And so that, the concept of Flourish Cafe was born from that. And that was it, really. And then I presented it, and the group loved it. And I was lucky enough to get some funding for the pilot events. As well, so I applied for some arts and humanities research funding. So that helped to fund, the time, the catering, the resources, the materials, the venue hire, and all that sort of equipment hire, all that for running, community events around flourishing, helping to bring different people together to explore flourishing and what it means for them in their community. So So that's really the birth of it. Yeah, that's it really. But I'm really excited about it, to be honest. It's potentially really high impact.
Yeah, and describe what that impact looks like. And is this something that you're evaluating in some way?
Yeah. I mean, so some of the thinking that goes behind it is in terms of moral development and informal education. So the sorts of outcomes that I'm looking for example, I mean, it's very open-ended, I have to say. So it's not strictly defined, but the sorts of things I'm hoping that it will provide are spaces where, in the context of a polarized nation and world, in the context of people losing their way with understanding how to flourish, in the context of poverty or, all these sorts of big social issues, climate, whatever, you name it, people need the sorts of skills to navigate a complex social environment. So that's what I want in terms of impact, is to facilitate, to support, is communities learning how to navigate complex social environments and complex internal environments in themselves. So it's, in a way, it's kind of building on some of the hopes of positive psychology, yeah, which is, reflecting on, personal development and what flourishing means for them. And in part it's that. But then I've got these three levels where there's that sort of personal level, there's a community level, and then there's a social political level. And so we ask participants to consider those three levels towards the end of the events, where they can really begin to realize their own responsibilities to themselves, to their community, and in society. But it's not judgmental and it's not dogmatic. So there's no element where people have to on any of that. It's just that's my hope, and so that's my hope in terms of impact. And the evaluations have been outstanding. People are feeling connected within their communities. People are reflecting on flourishing. They're beginning to develop hope. I think hope is the key word from these events. They're developing hope. And they're beginning to think about how to develop more robust local communities that are engaged in issues that matter. Whether that be developing small task and finish groups or small committees, or engaging with their local political representation, or just developing their own projects, their own community projects. Whatever it might be, this is all happening as a result of Flourish Cafe. So
great. And so when you say those three levels, do they count kind of as then context? Like, just is that a move towards clarifying context so that you're all sort of on the same page? That individual versus community versus sort of socio-political?
I mean, well, what it means to them, what those areas mean to them is different, and it is contextual, so it's different to each person. Okay. So there's not, like, for example, a set of measures or outcomes like, did you speak to your political representatives? Like it's as if it's a necessary thing that they need to do. It's just whatever. I'm curious to know if they have engaged with their political representatives, but that's not a measure of whether there's any impact at the social political level. We've got to bear in mind that obviously everyone is coming from different socio-economic positions. So, the middle class upwards are going to have more time generally to deal with that sort of stuff, whereas a lot of the working class communities or those that are reliant on social welfare or whatever, their time is often, constrained with dealing with disability or dealing with family care or these other things. So it's a lot more limited. So you can't have one set of outcomes that you might hope from each person. It really is personal, So it's really just a space for them to reflect and discuss in groups. So they do small group work, and then they sort of move around the room with different groups talking about these subjects, and then we have group conversations afterwards and things. So it's really just providing a space for reflection and dialogue, and that is central. in terms of the philosophical method being applied in practical context. It's a space for reflection and dialogue, and that's how good thinking emerges.
That's great. I like that a lot. Reflection and dialogue. And can I just ask, maybe this is an annoying question, but I just want to make sure that the audience is really kind of, this is making sense. So you've raised the issue of normativity in flourishing. Is there something you've put in place specifically to manage that challenge when you're talking about flourishing in the Flourish Cafe?
No, because it's a different project. It's a different kind of thing. So the PhD and the forthcoming monograph is aimed at tackling misconceptions and problems, right? Mm-hmm. So it has a kind of very specific aim, if you like. Okay. Flourish Cafe is very open-ended. It's very much led from the people themselves. Yeah. So it's an emergent. So there is a certain amount of faith that's built into the World Cafe method. That there is an emerging wisdom. That it's almost like there's a line from Scripture, from the Bible, that says something like as stone polishes, a metal, so one man polishes another, something like that. Yeah, paraphrasing terribly, sorry, but something like that. So this is where you have the power of dialogue. Is that where you have conceptual misunderstandings and confusions, we can iron those out naturally through dialogue. We're learning from each other in that space of dialogical space. And so that is like an automatic checking on what is sense, what is nonsense, what is meaningful, what is not meaningful. That's where that happens. That's why dialogue is so important. So important, because that's where it happens in ordinary life, is we learn through informal learning, informal education, just through dialogue. That's how we polish our thinking. That's how we grow, develop. We meet others of interesting mind, and we bounce ideas off each other. That is an automatic checking process, if you like, as opposed to my thesis and that sort of project, which is kind of addressing a problem, a conceptual problem using robust academic sort of approaches. So this is very much an emergent, Flourish Cafe is a different thing entirely in that sense. It's an emerging thing, and there is a certain trust in the process that you will get emerging wisdom from the group dialogue dynamic, and it works. It does work.
Yeah, look, it's amazing. I'm really, it's really impressive. I'm gonna continue to follow Flourish Cafe. Particularly outcomes or anything that gets written up. I see that there's a website that I'll link to.
Oh yeah. And there are some images on the website that you can look at, and so you get to see the process and how it works, and some of the because it's driven as well from the creative using to use the modern language, left and right brain. I'm not a big fan of those sorts of theories, but using different aspects of your expression, creative expression. So emotions are important as well as the intellect. So it's balancing those two areas. And I do find that using the World Cafe method, you get, because you have this sort of visual thinking approach, it helps to clarify and crystallize things that are ambiguous and unclear. If you over intellectualize things, you create your own sort of, you put stumbling blocks in your way sometimes. So sometimes just working through intuitively and using visual language can help to clarify thinking in and especially around ideas of what's important and valuable. Yeah. And so that crystallizing what purpose and things like that. So that comes through the method. Yeah.
Fantastic. And how often do people meet? It's a once-off event, or does it repeat?
Yeah, it's a one-off event. I mean, it's very much an evolving approach. At this stage, they're one-off events, but they feed into larger policy events or other related events. So there is a strategic. So, for example, for the one that I just did recently up north in England, it's feeding into a 17-county sustainability strategy. So it's a form of grassroots. So that one of the attendees, one of my partner there, she's a member of this forum, and so she's going to be feeding the general insights into that forum, so that the decision makers of those 17 counties and the local authorities can consider it almost as a form of kind of community feedback, a way of consulting with the community. So the Flourish Cafes have been built on that premise to kind of act as a catalyst to other things happening, that can help to inform those other things happening, and that's aside from the smaller stuff that's happening with local groups and so on. Yeah.
All right. Well, amazing. Like it sounds. I think what I'm most impressed about the Flourish Cafe is I'm kind of a old school kind of traditional person. I think in some aspects, I am impressed that everything that seems to be, I mean, I might be completely reading this wrong way, but I'm impressed that what seems to be the successful elements of the Flourish Cafe are kind of in direct opposition to, the direction of modernity. Like dialogue, just dialogue alone, 120 characters or whatever it is on Twitter, compared to long form conversations that are having success on podcasts, but now clearly having, just face-to-face time, bringing people that live in proximity to each other, like, in front of them. They can be enemies on Twitter. So easily they could be enemies on Twitter if they even pass each other. Right. But once you are face-to-face, I think, all of that confusion can be ironed out, like you said, through dialogue, which I think 95% of it is confusion rather than like true ideological differences.
Yeah, agree.
And so this just sounds great. I'm really excited to see how it continues to grow.
Thank you.
I have one final question. Two final questions. I won't hold you up for much longer, but just so I can be very clear, and you can this can almost be yes or no. How much of the issues that you point out in your thesis so far, that's around flourishing as a concept? How much does that apply? Those similar issues apply to concepts of well-being, which might be more precise, I guess, in their formulations.
Yeah. So well-being is a less problematic concept.
Okay.
If you understand it, if you still have work to do in order to carve up what you mean by well-being.
Yep.
And the different particular type of well-being and all the rest of it, because there are many different types, obviously. So there's still work to be done with those kinds of concepts, whether it be happiness, well-being, or whatever. Mm-hmm. But they're not as significant as they are with flourishing. Flourishing really is a kind of all-encompassing problematic concept, only when you try to carve it up in the way that the researchers have. Yes. It's fairly straightforward in ordinary parlance, but we know what we mean when we talk about a flourishing child. How's Sammy doing? Oh, she's flourishing. We don't have an issue with understanding what we mean in ordinary contexts. But in the literature, it's trying to fit it to the paradigm. That's the central problem there. But it is a more complex and nuanced concept than well-being, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. I'm glad.
Well-being is more straightforward. Yeah. As long as you do the right due diligence with carving up the different types of well-being, etc., which pretty much most of the researchers do, then it's less problematic. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good to hear. And that probably that's a good question to ask before my final question. But how much do you have a sense that your work has been in front of a positive psychology audience? And I'm only really just bringing up positive psychology because they're kind of the field most associated with flourishing.
Of course, exactly, yeah.
Like, are you sort of submitting to be at conferences, or have you had people reach out, or have you had any exposure so far?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know quite how this happened, but I was given like more or less a half an hour. So the Harvard Community of Practice meetings are, I think they're monthly, but sometimes they're a bit less often than that. And they have various speakers in from different updates, if you like, of research that's going on in the field of human flourishing. So I was really honoured to be invited to the January meeting, and I was given like almost half an hour. Whereas the way that it tends to work is 5 minute, maximum 10-minute
Wow.
updates. So I don't know what happened there, but probably because they realised it's complicated. You know, it needs a little bit more time to be articulated and communicated to that community. But anyway, I was really fortunate to be given so much time. So I had so that was in January, and that's been headed up by Dr. John Beale, who you probably are familiar with as well. So his work in he's been working on character traits, flow as well, and schools, well-being and flourishing in schools and education. So that's his sort of area. But his thesis was also in Wittgenstein, so he does get my work. Cool. Was on scientism, but so I had good exposure at the Harvard Community of Practice meeting there. There's obviously the leadership for Flourishing group, which I meet regularly with, headed up by Katie Granville Chapman and Emmy Budson. So that meets monthly. So updates and things there as well. There's the Global Flourishing Goals group, which I've had, there's some positive psychologist, influence there. I'm just trying to think what else. I have spoken at the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain conference almost every year, done something, workshop or poster or something, but that's not necessarily the positive psychology field, although they are influenced, positive educators and etc. They're influenced by that field. I'm just trying to think who else. That's probably the main. They're probably the main ones. I'm just trying to think. Is there anyone else?
It's a good place to start.
I suppose my work, the one that I did at the beginning of my research, or fairly early on anyway, in Amsterdam, that was around education, flourishing, and wonder. And that was Todd Kashdan was there as one of the keynotes, and so he's obviously influenced a lot by the field. So I spoke at that conference as well. So I have been fairly active, to be honest, at a number of different conferences, but they're usually not targeted at the positive psychology researchers, apart from the recent ones. Yeah. Generally, they're pitched at philosophy or education audiences.
And as we said, I think that the term, like the notion of well-being and kind of the mission of positive psychology is now being adopted, I think, whole scale across disciplines. So it's kind of like less relevant, I guess, in my opinion.
It needs to. I need to work with them, and I've been reaching out, and it's been good. It's worth mentioning that it has been challenging at some points. With this global goals group, for example, there was some difficulty in, even after time, them grasping some of these issues that we've talked about today. Some of the group, a wonderful bunch, really, an honor to be part of that initiative and that group, and all great people. But these philosophical issues are not always easy to grasp for those within the social science paradigm. Because there's always the kind of, even if they get the idea of, in a very simple sense of context and the importance of context and things like that, there is this idea, well, then what? How do we still measure it?
Yeah.
There's still this imperative to measure it. Mm-hmm. And so when you're driven by this imperative to measure and to generalize, you're still missing the point.
Yeah, look, I can imagine that must feel like the risk from your perspective, that people could hear this, say, yep, great idea, Eri, cool, and just keep going on their merry way and
just
not
keep
change.
Going. Right.
Yeah. And they would be rewarded for having done that, right? The system kind of rewards perpetual, motion.
Churn, yeah.
All right, great. Well, on that semi, I don't know what to call that, on whatever note that was, look, I really appreciate your time. I think what you're doing is great. I'm really eager to keep following it along, and I wish you all the best. So thanks again for being on the show.
Been a delight. Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks. All right. Thanks, everyone. He's pretty impressive, isn't he? Huge thank you to Eri for being a part of the show. More of this in the field, I think, is what we need to see. Anyway, so thank you again to Eri. If you've enjoyed it, if you think you know someone who's using the word flourishing in an inappropriate way, share this with them. Otherwise, you know the usual, like and subscribe wherever you're watching this thing. And thank you.